Chapter 9 Deep Freeze. A little snow fell in Big Bar Creek before Christmas, but there was no difficulty in getting out of the valley. I went to Vancouver again for the holiday and was there over the New Year. After Christmas, in Vancouver, the weather was usually severe. Transcontinental trains were as much as 2 days late. Buses were lost all night, and cars were buried in snow drifts. We heard on the radio that there were low temperatures and several feet of snow in the Caribou District, so I started back to school a day earlier than I should have done otherwise. I reached Ashcroft that night and went on to Clinton in the doctor's car the next afternoon. A blizzard was raging and driving was difficult. At Clinton, the temperature was 50 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. I learnt that the road to Big Bar Creek had been impassable for a week, but that the snow plow had been through that day to open it up for the stage truck tomorrow. I hurried off to the office to book a seat on the truck. There were so many passengers that the truck would not accommodate them all, so a taxi was laid on for the overflow. I rode in the car, which went ahead of the truck. It was a lovely ride to Jesmond. The car was warm and comfortable, and under the dazzling snow, the views were even more beautiful than usual. The mountain house had been for the past couple of weeks a haven of refuge, like a monastery in the Swiss Alps, and the Coldwells had spent their time stoking fires and dispensing hot meals to succor the half-frozen travelers who were stranded there. I stayed long enough to collect my mail, and then the driver took me on the 10 or 11 miles down to the school. When we arrived, he could not turn the car off the road because of the depth of snow, so we set out to carry the parcels down to the cabin. I floundered thigh-deep through the snow with a 10 weeks old puppy wrapped up in a blanket in my arms. The driver followed with the parcels. When I had managed to open the door and had deposited the puppy and the parcels in the chill, dark cabin, I turned to the driver and said, "I'll come and help you with the baggage." "What baggage?" he asked, and I discovered, to my dismay, that all my groceries had been stowed in the stage truck and would not be coming down from Jesmond until the next morning. I returned thanks that I had left plenty of food in the cabin before the holidays. I set to work making the place habitable. The temperature, even inside the cabin, was below zero. How far below, I did not know, because the indoor thermometer did not register below zero. There was enough wood on the pile inside the cabin to start the fire. Then I dug some blocks out of the deep snow outside and began to chop them. Every piece I cut leapt into the snow and was buried, so it took a long time. I had to make 2 journeys to the creek, first to break trail, and then to fetch the water. The ice was over a foot thick. I broke it with the axe and lowered my pail into the creek, but the water froze to the inside of the pail the moment it touched it. and by the time I got back to the cabin, it was all solid ice. I put the pail on the stove, and then went to gather a kettle full of snow. The trek to the creek was too exhausting, but I found it takes quite a lot of snow to produce even enough water for a cup of tea. I was surprised to hear a honk from the road. The taxi driver had not yet moved off. I realized afterwards that he was expecting me to return to the town, but it never occurred to me to do so. The cabin was warming up, so I filled my lamps and turned to thoughts of supper. I then met disaster. All my vegetables had frozen to pulp, and the contents of tins were rock solid. I made a sort of meal from thawed-out pineapple juice and Grandma Grinder's Christmas cake. There was one thing to be thankful for. There was no need to worry about damp sheets. The air was always so dry that the airing of mattresses and clothing, which one has to do after an English holiday, was unnecessary. I put the blankets to warm, however, and went to bed with a hot water bottle. The first time I had used one since I came to Canada. I could not leave the puppy to freeze after the fire went out, so Taffy and I kept each other warm as well as we could. I got up 3 times in the night to put on more fuel, but the fire was out long before morning, and when I awoke, the mercury was again right at the bottom of the thermometer. I left the hot water bottle, a rubber one, on the bed on top of the blankets after breakfast. When I went to make the bed, the contents of the bottle were ice. I breakfasted off cereal and milk made from powder. Then, since it seemed my life would depend on wood, I began to struggle with the axe. About 11:30, I heard the distant hum of the truck from Jesmond, and I hurried to get to the road. But it took them a while to unload all the packages, and I had plenty of time. When I saw the bags and boxes lying by the side of the road, and contemplated the labor it would take to wade through the snow over and over again, I could not withhold my tears. The 2 lads in the back of the truck leapt out without a word, and picked up the whole lot, and marched them down to the cabin for me. It was impossible, of course, to open school. I realized that it would take me all day to complete the chores necessary to keep me alive: wood chopping, water carrying, lamp filling, as well as attending to the fires and cooking my meals. The little Higginbottoms had pluckily made the journey down the mountain, and seemed quite disappointed when I said school was closed. None of the other children ventured out. It began to dawn on me that if I stayed in the valley under these conditions, I might perish. So with Taffy in my arms, I hailed the returning truck that afternoon, and the driver took me up to Jesmond. I came to have an unbounded admiration for the skill and tenacity of the stage and taxi drivers on the mountain roads, who see that the freight and passengers get through to their destinations, no matter how difficult the conditions may be. It was bad enough to drive down the valley on a summer day, with its precipitous roads and spiraling gradients, but when snow covered a surface of solid ice, or in spring when the snow water had washed areas out of the road surface, I thought sometimes that their efforts were superhuman. On one occasion, I was coming out of the valley at Easter time. The taxi was full, and the hour was late. An Indian family were in the back of the car, and I was in the front with the driver and his partner. The earth road was pitted with great mud holes and puddles. The driver had to judge whether to go through them slowly and cautiously, in which case he would probably stick in the middle, or step on the gas and perhaps rip the bottom out of his tank with a hidden rock. It was very difficult to gauge the depth of the puddles. On this particular night, we had come 20 or 30 miles without mishap. Then, as we bumped carefully through a long, gleaming mud hole, we stuck. It was pitch dark and drizzling with rain. The driver and his partner got out of the car, but advised us to stay where we were, as the mud was ankle deep. Then the two men worked with determination to free us. They knew they had no hope of any help from passing traffic within days, and the nearest cabin was miles away, so they had to do it themselves. They began by taking a log out of the fence and using it to lever up the car. Then Terry, the driver, crawled underneath and strewed spruce boughs to give the wheel something to bite on. The engine roared and the wheels spun, but we only dug ourselves deeper into the mud. They replaced the fence rail, and then, in the light from the headlamps, cut down a young tree and rammed this under the car. Using it as a lever, they depressed the end of the tree so that the front of the car, with us in it, was lifted clean off the ground. Terry, who was not a young man, hung on to the end of this, while Tom groveled under the car with a spade and dug out the mud. At last, after 2 hours of exhausting effort, they succeeded, and we went on our way without further mishap. This feat amazed me, but they regarded it as merely part of the day's work. So it was with the drivers between Big Bar Creek and Jesmond. When the driver came to the long, steep, tortuous piece of road near the end of the journey, he knew that it was very unlikely that he could take it without a break. There were hairpin bends on steep inclines. When the truck stalled, the driver would open the cab door and lean halfway out, with one hand on the steering wheel. The truck would run backwards at an alarming speed, straight for the rim of the precipice, and I would close my eyes and resign myself to my fate. But the driver knew just when to turn the wheel. Then he would begin again, and the engine would roar, and the wheels would spin a rut into the snow. If necessary, he would get out to strew sand or spruce boughs, and somehow they would get out of it. The mail truck might be late, but it always arrived. When we arrived at Jesmond, we heard that the stage truck was marooned at Gang Ranch and might be hours late. But I had a stroke of luck in that the police car was out here and would give me a lift into Clinton. That night I was back again, in the Clinton teacherage, among the family of the school principal. The house was a bungalow, with the rooms all opening onto a passage in the floor of which there was a grid called the register. This grid was immediately over the oil furnace, and heat in the house was regulated by turning an indicator in the kitchen wall to the required temperature. The oil from the storage tank outside the house fed directly into the furnace. The windows were thickly coated inside with an undulating layer of ice, where the moisture from our breathing froze on coming into contact with the cold glass. But the rooms themselves were very warm. From Clinton, I rang up the secretary of the school board to explain my absence from school. Nick had resigned the previous summer, and his successor had never been down the valley and did not know how difficult conditions were there. I was instructed to return to school next week with the school trustee, who would be returning to his ranch by truck. On my way back to the valley the next week, Mr. Robertson told me that the school board had ordered Alfie Higginbottom to make any necessary repairs to my cabin so that it would be warm and weatherproof. When we arrived, I found Alfie and his boys working there. They had come down by horse-drawn sleigh, and the horses were standing outside. Alfie had made a fire beside them in an empty oil drum to prevent them from freezing where they stood. He was busy inside the cabin fixing up a heater stove in my bedroom. The heater had been there since before I arrived the previous year, but there was no chimney to it. Alfie now cut a hole in the roof and fixed the stove pipe, then lined the ceiling round it with zinc so that the snow would not come in. While working in the roof, he found chinks between the logs, big enough to put your hand through, so he plugged these with newspaper. The boys, meanwhile, had been digging trails through the deep snow from the cabin to the wood pile, the creek, and the school. Finally, Alfie effected a vital repair to my can opener and fixed my bedroom window so that it would not blow out of its frame with the first strong blast from the north. There had been low temperatures occasionally the previous year, but they had never lasted more than about 36 hours at a time. Now, for 2 continuous weeks, there had been this intense cold, and it was to be a long time before it ended. Daily, I hoped to be able to open school, but the temperature on successive days was 20, 25, 35, and 40 degrees below zero, according to the outdoor thermometer. My house was very warm when the fires were burning well, but it soon chilled when the wood burnt low. During the night, Taffy would thrust a sudden cold nose into my face with a whimper when he felt the temperature drop, and I would get up and replenish the fuel in the heater. I spent the hours of daylight struggling to keep myself alive. Mountains of wood had to be chopped, and as I had now got near the end of the pile and down to the knotty wood, I found it very hard work. The water that I brought up from the creek remained thick with ice, even though I stood the buckets under the stove. Nothing moved in the valley. If I had had an accident with the axe, I could have bled to death, but I never thought of this at the time. My only anxiety was lest the house should take fire. I had brought the cans of oil and gasoline inside the house now, since if they froze, I should be in the dark. So I left the house door unlocked when I went to bed, in case I had to get out in a hurry. I began to feel a desperate need to get back to Clinton, and on the next mail day I was relieved to have a note from the school trustee authorizing this. I spent the next 3 weeks in the comfort of the Clinton teacherage, justifying my existence by helping with the teaching there. For 3 more weeks the low temperature persisted, varying from 20 degrees to 25 below zero. This sort of weather was at least approved of by the ice hockey players. Enthusiasm was so great that spectators would stand round the outdoor rink for a couple of hours at a time when the temperature was not more than 20 degrees below, keeping their feet warm by stamping on the wooden boards, and from time to time popping into the heated shack where coffee and hot dogs were on sale. Big Bar Creek School reopened after the Christmas vacation on February 9th, 1950. For a week or so, the weather was glorious. The Chinook, or warm west wind, sending torrents of snow water cascading down the mountain sides, and the sunlight gleaming on the snow. Since the cold weather, the radio had ceased to function, and I had no check on the time. Sometimes I misjudged this badly. I would prepare, eat, and wash up after my breakfast, mop my kitchen floor, mark a set of books, and still the children would not have arrived. But more often I was just ready when I saw them coming. They were very punctual, but the little alarm clock in school began to be somewhat unreliable. It occurred to me that it was only in school hours that it worked erratically, and after a little observation, I discovered that the hands were being moved back about 10 minutes at the beginning of the recess, and forward at the end of it. So one day I kept the school behind for half an hour to make up for time lost, and that was a satisfactory deterrent. Winter was not over, however. The snow and cold weather returned, and the skates were still in use. Old Johnny's family had moved up to a house nearer the school, where Old Bill had lived. Here they made a skating rink on a frozen, flooded patch by the creek, and the skates had been in such demand by big brothers and fathers, as well as by children, that they were almost worn out. I was amazed at the progress the children had made. They streamed over the ice, circling and about turning, crouching on their heels, forming figure eights. Lying by the roadside, a little way up the valley, with her neck gracefully arched and her chestnut hide shining in the sunlight, was Minnie's little mare. She had slipped her colt the day after Christmas, and lying there had frozen to death. She looked beautiful, like a bronze statue, but when the thaw came, Minnie's brothers hitched her behind the team and dragged her up the mountainside. For days we watched from below, the eagles and ravens gathering from afar to strip the flesh from her bones. The first week in March, we had snow again. It made everything look so clean and lovely that I could not regret it. The snow was fine and powdery, swept into whirls where the air currents had had free play, and the children loved to play in it. When clothing was covered with snow, you had only to shake it off. A broom was kept on the doorstep of every home, and before entering, you were expected to brush the snow off your boots. When the children first saw Taffy, they did not think much of him. He was a Welsh terrier, and they were not accustomed to such small dogs. They had no use for a dog that could not herd cattle or hunt cougar, but the dogs in the valley loved him, especially Spike, who would sleep on my doorstep all night for the chance of playing with Taffy in the morning. Spike was part collie and part bloodhound. He could run like the wind, and he would fly down the trail to the creek and away into the underbrush, with Taffy after him. There he would squat in the snow until Taffy had gone streaking past, and then bounce up and chase him. The two of them would frisk down to the creek with me before breakfast and disappear, full of the joy of life. One morning Spike came back alone, in spite of my calling and whistling. Taffy did not reappear. Patches of the creek were open where the current was very swift, and I began a frantic search for Taffy. Above the bank of deep snow, which overhung the near side of the stream, I spotted a moving twig. There was no wind, so I climbed the slope behind me for a better view, and I saw below Taffy's little head bobbing up and down out of the creek, and his front paws struggling to get a foothold on the ice. I rushed down and threw myself flat on the snow, praying that the ice underneath would hold. I could just reach him, and when he survived that ducking, I decided that he could survive anything. Spike's days were numbered, however. One thing against him was that, like Freckles, he was a coward. Cecil tested this one night. My cougar skin had now arrived, mounted as a rug, with the wicked teeth shining from gaping jaws. One dark night, Cecil draped himself in the rug and hid in my bedroom. The boys brought Spike into the cabin, and when the cougar came growling from under my bedroom curtain, Spike's terror was ludicrous. Another mark against him was due to the fact that he would not stay at home, but haunted my house. I refrained from feeding him, in the hope that he would go home, but he still wandered, so he was shot. Taffy provided a new means of making the teacher get mad, or so the children anticipated. One lunch hour, they were sitting round my step in the sunshine, when Edgar said ostentatiously, "Come here, you son of a bitch." I went on hanging out my dishcloth. After a moment, Michael said, "Hey, you're not supposed to let us use that word." "Which word?" I asked innocently. "You know," said Michael. "Bitch," said Ralph. "Why not?" I asked. "We're not supposed to say it," said Viva. "Why not?" said I. "It's in the dictionary." This had to be verified. Pete fetched a dictionary. "Sure, it's in the dictionary," said Pete. Is there anything wrong with using the words sow and mare? I asked. Taffy is the son of a bitch. It is only when you apply that expression to a man that it becomes offensive, for the simple reason that you are insulting his mother. We had a dance to celebrate St. Patrick's Day, of course. Our dances were always held on the Saturday night nearest to the festival, but this time we chose badly. Wet snow was falling. However, quite a crowd of people turned out. Around midnight, young Alfie and Pete went over to my house to make the coffee. They were away a long time. Later on, when I went over to my cabin, I was surprised to find Pete, Fred, Ralph, and Douglas sitting round my stove. Pete's socks were drying on my oven door. I said, "Well, boys, I think you might have asked me before coming to sit in here." Fred said, "When we came in, your little dog was at your cupboard there." I went to my meat safe. The door, which usually swung to of its own accord, was wide open. The little joint of meat which I had cooked that day, and which had to last me a week, until the next stage day, was gone. I went into the bedroom and found Taffy chewing a large bare bone. I spanked him. This caused me so much mirth that another thought struck me. I went back to look at the safe and found that the door was propped open. So, the theft had been staged and was supposed to be a joke. The boys had eaten the meat themselves, most likely. I was very much upset, not primarily because I had lost my meat, but because they had played such a malicious trick on me. Although I regarded them as friends, they still considered me an outsider. I sent the boys back to school, and I followed them and told the assembled company what had happened and how I felt about it, saying that I could no longer enjoy the party and should leave them to finish it by themselves. Big Dick was present to take charge. He was the only white man who was a regular attender at our dances. The party went on for another hour or so. I could hear the rhythm of the feet, and see the shadow of the dancers crossing the patch of light thrown by the windows on the snow, and hear the laughter roused by the square dances. But I felt very much depressed. It was on occasions like this that I was aware of my isolation. There was no one with whom I could discuss my perplexities. It was not until some time afterwards that I realized that the youth who had been responsible for the stone-throwing attack had been helping with the coffee making in my cabin. Chapter 10. Tooth and Claw. The snow was with us until the middle of May that year, but when spring did come at last, there was rapid growth. The mountain slopes soon showed a film of green, and the undergrowth down by the creek was lush. Every morning when I opened my cabin door, I was met with waves of perfume from the opening leaf buds and sweet briar bushes. There were masses of wild flowers to come across bushes festooned with the flowers of purple clematis against the darker green of the fir trees gave me a shock of pleasure. One afternoon we had gone out for nature study to see how many wild flowers we could find. The children were scattered over a meadow at the foot of the slope when somebody looked up towards the top of the range and called out, "The horses are coming." They all went running, flinging themselves to the ground behind the nearest rock or bush, while I stood with my mouth agape, wondering what was causing the excitement. Ralph raised himself and shouted with emphatic gestures, get down, you'll be killed." "The horses are coming," yelled Michael. "Get down, they'll stampede." I looked upwards and could just see the horses streaming over the top of the range, followed by 2 tiny cowboy figures, silhouetted against the sky. They seemed far enough away, but the children were insistent that I should efface myself, so I ran to the nearest rock. I lay there watching the cowboys, little Johnny and his brother Henry, they turned out to be, coming down the sheer face of the mountain in a series of sideways leaps, like deer, little clouds of dust spurting up from their horses' heels. A few moments later, the horses were thundering across our path, and I appreciated the necessity to get down. Pressing behind them came little Johnny and Henry, herding them towards a gap in the fence of another meadow. They had carefully removed the logs which provided the fence rails at one point to make an entrance, but many of the horses leapt the fence. These seasonal activities of the valley were reproduced most successfully by the children in the drawings which they made in their spare minutes. Their success had amazed me from the outset. I did not attempt to instruct them in any way indeed. I had not the ability to do this. My contribution consisted in building up their confidence in their own power to express what they felt, or to record what they had experienced. I never had to set a subject for a picture. They always had so much to say. They had a natural sense of pattern and composition, and a natural understanding of perspective, in which they would set themselves the most difficult problems and solve them with ease. Perhaps this was due to the accuracy of their observation, and to the fact that their viewpoint was generally from above the scene, the typical convention which I had met with in the drawings of English children, of leaving an empty space between the sky and the ground, never occurred in their works, for the simple reason that to them the sky always appeared to meet the ground along the top of the mountain range. The nature diary was now full of descriptions from every child in the school of incidents they had experienced. "Last year we were hang up at the meadows," said Floyd, "when Jack killed a snake, and he hung it on the fence. Bill came, and he stroked his foot along her belly, and she puked up 6 little ones. I was not prepared to accept this. I knew that snakes laid eggs, but the other children corroborated Floyd's story, and on consulting a reference book, I found that the garter snake, which is common in the district, bears living young. Dick wrote in June, "I saw an eggshell on the road. I picked it up and gave it to Mickey. It was a swallow's, and it was white." Douglas could now produce consecutive sentences to tell his stories. I was hang in the field with Pete and Dad, and Peter told me to take his horse to the creek to water it. Just as I was getting on him, my foot hit him in the flank, and he started to buck. Dad shouted to me to jump off, but I stayed on him for a while, and then I jumped off. Arthur was interested in all the wildlife in the valley. I saw a blue grouse yesterday, and it flew away and lit beside the creek, and I saw a magpie, and it is dead. It is frozen in the ice by a tree. The cow is dead, and the magpies eat the dead cow, and the dog chases the magpies away. The dog is stingy, and he will fight anything. Viva wrote in April, "The day before yesterday, Dad and little Henry and little Johnny were breaking wild horses. I was watching them. First, they caught the horse we put in the stampede. They would not ride him because he bucks. Then they caught the iron gray. He surely can buck. They had a rope round his neck, but he jumped up above the corral. My dad caught another gray. It was Minnie's horse. He bucks too. The iron gray tried to jump over the other corral, but he did not succeed. He just balanced himself on the fence. They got Homebrew out and saddled him up, and then pulled straws to see which one would ride him. Little Henry got the long straw the first 3 times. Then Jack came up, and he pulled. Little Johnny got the straw, so he rode him. The horse did not buck. Minnie told of a trip up the mountain. We went up the mountain to pick husham to make drinks for the summer. We stayed at Grantley's place. There were coyotes howling every night, and Eddie's dogs were barking all night long. Cecil slept out on the veranda. In the middle of the night, he got cold and came into the house. In the morning, we went picking husham. We saw where the bears had been breaking husham bushes and eating ant piles. Ralph described another adventure in the hay field. When I was hanging up at the meadows, Alfie and I were patching the fence when we saw an eagle. He picked up Buster, the collie dog, and took him in the air about 6 feet. I ran to get the gun, but Alfie whistled by me like wind. The eagle lit on a tree, and I looked at it. I heard a shot. Alfie was in front of the house, shooting. Dad said, "Get the 25-35. But I grabbed some 22 shells, and we shot again. He was on a different tree. We ran over there, but he flew away." It was against the law for the school children to use guns, of course, but these children needed to know how to use them, and they were as proficient with them as with the axe. Michael wrote, "One day, when the sun was just going down, Mom said I could go hunting grouse. Pete and Edgar went up the side of the mountain, and I went across the creek. I was about 3/4 up the mountain when I heard a she-grouse hoot. I saw her run down through the trees. I ran up a ridge and saw it stop. I shot, but missed it. The second time I shot, I hit it, and it rolled down. I caught it and plucked it. As I was plucking, I heard a hooter and went after it. I shot at it and missed. Then it flew away. Pete told of his first visit to a stampede. On Friday afternoon, Fred and I went to Dog Creek to see a stampede for the first time. We rode up to Canoe Creek the first night, and we stayed with Talia. We had to sleep on the floor. Fred and I went on to Dog Creek the next day. They had bucking horses and bareback horses. The bucking horses bucked so much that one nearly threw itself over backwards. Bert Grinder was riding him. Stanley Alex was riding another bucking horse, and he turned right over, and Stanley turned over slowly too. I was going to run my horse in the pony race, but he had wandered away, so Henry Grinder told me I could ride his baldy horse in the race, and I did, and I came in second. They had backward races, and Arthur Rossett won first and second, both. He went round the circle twice, and the others never went even once. Edgar wrote in May, Dad told Pete and me to go and get a team up at Noel's. We saddled the horses. I rode Chipmunk and Pete rode Clipper. When we were on our way, Chipmunk went lame, so Pete put some shoes on him up at Dave's. On the other side of the old schoolhouse, we saw 7 deer. We were only about 20 feet from them, but they did not seem scared of us. They just walked into the bushes. On the way to the OK Ranch, we saw ducks and geese on the lakes. May is one of the close season months, when hunting is not permitted. The animals seem to know when they are safe from the gun. Marjorie gave a descriptive account of how to strip hides. A few days ago, I decided to strip some deer hides. I went up into the shed and got 2 hides, one big buck and a little one. I put them in a big tank, and every time we washed clothes, we would put the soapy water into the tank. I left the hides in the soapy water for about 4 days. Jack made a frame for me to strip the hide on, and Melanie lent me a blade. You throw half of the hide over the pole on which you are stripping, and after you have finished stripping, you soak the hide in soapy water and brains overnight. You squeeze this all through the hide, then wring it as dry as you can, and put it on a frame and stretch it. You now punch it with a sharp rock on the end of a stick. Punch it until it gets dry and soft, then take it off the frame and smoke it. Now it is buckskin and ready to be made into whatever you want it for. There was one entry in the Nature Diary, however, which was as thrilling as any magazine story, a casually written account of an adventure with a cougar, when the boys concerned, having no weapon with which to defend themselves, improvised a snare with which to strangle her. We had had a holiday the previous day to celebrate the king's birthday, and I asked the children if they would tell me of any adventure they had had on the holiday. Fred and Jack had set out on an errand to a cabin on the other side of the range to deliver a sack of potatoes. They were each riding their own horse, and they had with them a little colt as a pack horse, and an 8-months-old collie pup, Rover. They rode for some miles, then left the sack of potatoes at the fork in the trail, and went on to old Kitty Ann's cabin to spend the night. The next morning they rode back and collected the sack of potatoes, put it on the colt, and set off. We had gone down the trail about 20 yards, says Fred, when Jack yelled, "Cougar!" I thought he was fooling me, but the first thing I knew, a cougar jumped out of the sage. She was after the colt, of course. Apparently the idea of flight never entered the boys' heads. They hollered, and the cougar began to lope down the slope, so they set the puppy after her. Rover ran at full speed and headed her off. She backed into a sage bush and started growling, and Rover did not know how to tackle her. If the cougar had slapped Rover once, says Fred, she would have killed him. So he called the dog back. Jack picked up a rock weighing about 3 pounds and let fly, hitting her in the ribs. That just made her stagger down the hill. She took refuge in a juniper bush, and Fred sent Rover out again. The dog jumped at the bush. The cougar snarled, and Fred called Rover back. By this time, the boys were determined to take a trophy home and collect the bounty. Fred hit his chaps with a rope, and the cougar slid out of the bush and climbed a tree. They decided that a sling would give more impetus to the rocks. So Fred sat down and cut the tongue of leather out of his boot to make the bag of the sling, but still they could do no more than bruise her. Then Jack had an idea. He told Fred to get a long, dry stick that would be light to handle. He took the rope from the pack horse and made a loop with it, which he tied with a bunch of grass to the stick. Then he climbed the tree next to the one in which the cougar was hiding. The cougar was not very far from Jack. She could easily have jumped on him, said Fred. Jack manipulated the noose until he had looped it over the cougar's neck. Then he broke the grass connection and threw the end of the rope down to Fred, who gave a sharp jerk, so that the cougar fell over the limb and choked to death. What presumption it would be on my part, I thought, to label these people as of low intelligence. I had yet another example of the quickness of reaction of the children one summer afternoon, when we were out on a nature walk. We were on the road going down the valley, and had just crossed the creek on a substantial wooden bridge without handrails. There was some wire netting round an empty shack, and the boys found a willow grouse suspended by the foot from this. It was newly dead, and we were debating as to whether it had been roosting on the fence and caught its foot when taking off. Taffy scented the grouse and started leaping up, and Ralph threw the bird across the creek. It fell short, landing in the water, and Taffy leapt straight in after it. The current swept him off, bobbing like a cork on the frothing water, but still fighting madly to get at the grouse, which floated just ahead of him. I was rooted to the bridge, but the children had all leapt down to the level of the water and were shrieking to Taffy on the other side of the stream. The grouse was held up by some overhanging boughs, and Taffy grabbed it, but the current made off with him again. A huge fallen log spanned the stream, and the puppy disappeared under it. We waited moments for him to reappear, and Ralph said, shaking his head, "He'll be drowned for sure." Douglas was thinking faster than any of us. He was racing through the undergrowth on the near side of the stream, crashing through briar bushes and rotten branches in a cloud of flying leaves. About 100 yards downstream, the creek swung to the left in a right-angled curve. Douglas reached this curve just in time to scramble down the bank, hook himself round a tree, and lean out to grab Taffy by the scruff of the neck as the current swung him across the stream. There was a happy reunion, and the children asked, "If Taffy had been drowned, should you have cried?" "I might have," I replied, and Floyd promptly exclaimed, with his face beaming, "Gee, let's throw him in again." When he was pulled out of the water, Taffy still had his grouse, and his prestige with the children advanced considerably. Dick said, "That little dog sure can swim." I had by now sent a report to Vancouver on the results of the courtesy campaign. Minnie and Viva were in the running for the prize. The boys, alas, had failed to maintain their initial enthusiasm, and Marjorie had been too outspoken on occasion. In the end, it was decided by common agreement that Minnie had earned the prize. The bicycle arrived by the next stage delivery, a pretty blue and white machine, not new, but newly painted, complete with pump and toolkit. Minnie was thrilled. Everything was examined and commented on with wonder, especially the connection in the pump, and after Minnie had had a few rides, the others all keyed up for turns. They scorned my offers of help, and with their usual independence and determination, just threw themselves onto the bicycle and rode it. A few days later, Minnie described to me her first skid. "I was coming down the road too fast," she said, "and the bike went sideways and bucked me off." Chapter 11. Farewell to Big Bar Creek. We now learnt that the little log schoolhouse was to be replaced at the end of the term by a handsome new school built to government specifications, with an attractive teacherage attached. A meeting was called to decide the location of the new school. In my opinion, the present location could not be improved upon, being far enough away from the road and with plenty of playing space around it. It was also conveniently placed to be within reach of the families using it. However, as most of the men in the valley were busy haying, there was a poor representation of the native people present, but the ranchers were there, and the Coldwells came down from Jesmond, and the inspector, of course, attended, and the general feeling of the meeting was that the new school should be built further up the valley, as there were more young children at the top of the mountain. The school trustee told me that the school board would have to deduct a proportion of my salary as rent for the new teacherage. By the present arrangement, I occupied my log cabin rent-free, and I replied, half jokingly, "I don't suppose anyone would wish to pay for the privilege of living the sort of life I live in the valley." The ranchers, who by reason of the Cameron Report were heavily taxed for educational purposes, resented the seemingly extravagant amount which the board was required to contribute towards the building of the schoolhouse and teacherage. Funds for education in the various school districts were obtained from taxes on land owned and not on income, and one of the ranchers, for instance, who owned hundreds of acres of land, much of which was unproductive mountain, had had to pay a school tax the previous year of $1,500. It was quite understandable that the school board should wish to recover some of their outlay on rent. The next day, the inspector visited the school to assess the progress the children were making. At his inspection the previous year, he had made appreciative comments and expressed satisfaction with the work done, but on this occasion he criticized my failure to conform to the program of studies, and disregarded the value there might be in my deviations from the prescribed curriculum. He asked, for instance, what unit the class had reached in spelling, and when I told him I was not following the units, but teaching the spelling of words used in compositions, he commented, "Spelling weak." He asked what I was doing in science, and I said I had substituted nature study. The windowsill was loaded with little jars containing labeled specimens of flowers, and the nature diary was displayed on the table. He never looked at them. "What are you doing in written work?" he asked, and I was pleased to present the children's composition books, but he brushed them aside. He was referring to the Think and Do books, which require the children to underline phrases and write yes or no after the statements. His comment was, "No written work." I had taken it for granted that he would have received a copy of the early correspondence I had had with the Department of Education, and I never thought of showing him my letter from the Superintendent of Education. When the holiday for the King's birthday came round this year, I decided that I would like to spend the day on the mountain in the hope of seeing a bear or a cougar. So I asked Melanie if she would lend me a horse, so that Minnie and I could go out for the day. It was arranged that Cecil and Fred should guide us up the coulee on the way to their camp. They were cutting trees for fence rails, and had a camp on top of the mountain. So, on a lovely June morning, the four of us set out, riding up the road to the foot of the mountain, and then taking the trail up the coulee. Taffy trotted behind us, and the squirrels and chipmunks chattered all around. The boys were loping ahead, but Minnie and I lingered. I heard the crack of a twig, and halted my horse. Minnie had not heard the sound, but she scanned the bushes, and suddenly whispered, "Look, a porcupine, a great big one." I looked in the direction in which she was pointing, but could see nothing except tree roots and branches. Taffy was scenting the air, but he too saw nothing unusual. We dismounted, and Minnie picked up a stick and threw it towards a tree stump. Then I saw the porcupine. The whole stump seemed to move, and the porcupine ambled off. Taffy saw him at the same moment, and leapt to attack. The next moment he yelped with pain, and plunged up to the neck in the nearby ditch. His nose was a cushion of barbed quills, 3 or 4 inches long. Minnie and I struggled to extract them, and his squeals rent the air. The boys came galloping back to see what was the matter. The porcupine had now disappeared, but the moment we released Taffy, he was off in pursuit, and he disappeared completely in the thick grass. Cecil strode around, cautiously probing the bushes, with his rifle at the ready. A porcupine is not killed wantonly, because if a man is lost in the woods without a weapon, the porcupine is his only source of meat. A sharp crack on the nose with a stick will kill the beast. But Cecil did not want to receive a slap from the porcupine's tail. We searched without success, and then waited in vain for Taffy to reappear. It was about half an hour before he came back, with 3 more quills in his nose, and I suggested that he must have killed the porcupine, because I did not think he would have left it otherwise. But the boys said that was impossible. Not even a cougar can kill a porcupine. After this episode, Taffy's fame spread, and the children began to realize that a terrier, though so small, is a sporting dog. I enjoyed the ride over the mountain. In spite of the heat down in the valley, we were caught in a storm of hail and snow on the mountain top, and had to shelter in a barn. Then we rode on through meadows, where we saw deer grazing in the distance, and we came on by another trail back to the road. On the way home, Taffy caught and killed a jackrabbit. One feature of life in the valley that it had taken me some time to get used to was the fact that it was not possible to go to church on Sunday. During the first week, when I heard the sweet tones of a bell floating down from the mountain, I had had a moment of pleased surprise. "Where is the church?" I had asked, only to learn that the bell whose note I had heard was hung round the neck of one of the horses. My own parish church was at Ashcroft, 80 miles away. There were several Anglican families between Clinton and the Fraser River, and the parson and his wife and little daughter made the long trip out to visit us during the summer. One Friday afternoon, towards the end of June, I had unexpected visitors. 2 young women driving a van labeled "The Sunday School by Post." They were very welcome guests. They camped by the creek, and the children, always full of curiosity when strangers came down the valley, gathered round to talk to them. On the Sunday afternoon, they held a Sunday school class in the school and distributed to the children colored pictures and little magazines, and I hoped they would come again the following year. My 2 years of grace were now almost over. I must decide whether or not I wished to attend a Canadian summer school in order to have my certificate extended, with authority to continue teaching in BC. However, on the last mail day of the term, I received a letter from the school board terminating my employment under them. I had received an unsatisfactory inspector's report. I was hurt and disappointed and frustrated in my plans for the children, but I was happy at the thought of going back to England to see my father again. We had a farewell party at the end of June. It started with a treasure hunt for a silver dollar, which I had hidden under the root of a plant that afternoon. I gave the children an area of search approximately 50 yards square, most of it covered with sagebrush, and I did not think there was a chance of anyone actually finding the dollar, though the prize would go to the nearest one. But Philip, who had ridden all day to come over from the Circle H ranch, followed a system, combing the area in parallel straight lines until he noticed a plant which was damp at the roots. He was right. I had watered the plant before replacing it. There was to be a softball match in the evening, school versus visitors, but this was delayed. The ball was lost. We searched everywhere and at last started to play with an old ball, which came out of its skin whenever it was hit. The children sewed it up with string twice, and then Pete fixed it by unraveling a thread of copper wire from the wireless aerial and sewing the skin with that. The mosquitoes were so thick that we had to burn a green wood fire in each corner of the pitch in the hope that the smoke would drive them away. The game went on until it was so dark that I could not see the players, yet they still hit and caught the ball. Then of course we danced. I shall never hear another radio hillbilly program without visualizing that little log schoolhouse with the gay and colorful dancers, the fiddlers fiddling madly, Big Dick swinging Dolly off her feet, the babies sleeping on the desks, till the light of dawn spreads over the gray mountains, and the sound of voices and hoof beats die away in the distance. On the last afternoon, after the children had all gone home, old Johnny rode down to see me. "Goodbye," he said, as we shook hands. "You're the best teacher we ever had in this valley, and my children love you." And that was a tribute which I have kept in my heart. Postscript. I went home to England in July, but I was back again in September. Canada still drew me like a magnet. My urge now that I had been initiated was to go north to the Yukon, for instance, or the Great Bear Lake, to experience the sort of life described by Jack London in those stories which I had devoured in my teens. So my next schoolmarm adventure was among the children of the Arctic, little Indians and Eskimos at Aklavik in the Mackenzie River Delta. It was 3 years before I came out of the north, in July 1953, on my way across Canada for the last time. I visited the valley once more to say goodbye to the children of Big Bar Creek. I found many changes. The old log schoolhouse was now a bunkhouse for Johnny and his hunting clients, and Melanie and little Minnie lived in my teacherage. Arthur's picture still decorated the wall, though it was faded and smoke-browned. Jack and Manny were dead, a double sacrifice to the god whiskey. The winter after I left, they were driving a car home one night. The car ran off the road into a lake, and Manny was drowned. Jack managed to struggle to the bank, but died of exposure. Marjorie, unwed, was the mother of 2 children. She had been fond of Jack, I knew. Perhaps her world crumpled when he died. More than half my former pupils had not had a day's schooling since I left, for the simple reason that the new school was inaccessible to them, being 8 miles further up the mountain. Since their parents were not literate, correspondence courses were of no use to them. I thought that these children must have felt themselves deserted. It is under such conditions that childhood naughtiness develop into grosser attempts to get even with society. Canada is awake to the necessity of conserving her natural resources. Human material is the most valuable resource she has.